Hello, welcome to the Western Sydney Community Forum's interactive live stream forum. My name is David Hill and I'm your host for today's session. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this meeting is on the traditional custodians, acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands that we're meeting on today for our session. I am personally standing on Darug land and I pay my respects to elders on this land and beyond, both past, present, and in the future. I also acknowledge with respect Aboriginal friends and colleagues who are joining us here today. Thank you for being here with us on this very special Melbourne Cup Day. It's great to be doing something different apart from watching a horse race. Today, we are talking about the social impact of loneliness. This is part of a series that really began with the beginning of COVID-19, and it's really the Western Sydney Community Forum's response to make sure that we as a community sector can communicate and deal with all of the issues that we face through this time. This is a pretty tough time. And of course, our human services play a really important role in ensuring that we get through what's been a tough time and hopefully come out the other end of this. Today, this issue of the social impact of loneliness will allow us to look at the issue of how people have been isolated for some period of time, what we as service providers can do about it, can look at issues regarding the young, the old, the different parts of our community that maybe we don't often consider. You will have an opportunity to contribute to the conversation and ask questions today. Couple of options. You can click the raise hand button on your device and you will join a queue. We'll invite you to share through your voice facility. If you prefer, you can click on the Q&A button on your device and type your comment or question, which I will read on your behalf. Comments and questions will be responded to on a first in, first served basis. We're going to do our best to respond to all of those questions. Note that those joining on the live stream can also post comments and questions on the stream. They will be shared in the forum. The chat and video function is not available for this session today, but really I'm here to introduce some important speakers. We've got with us today Rachel Bowes. Rachel works at Lifeline. She's the head of the Crisis Services and Quality at Lifeline Australia. She's got clinical responsibility for all Lifeline services, including the development and delivery of the Crisis Support Service, which currently receives around 1 million contacts per year from Australians in crisis or at risk of suicide. Hi, Rachel, welcome here today.
Thank you.
We also have Councillor Charishma Kaliyanda, Councillor at Liverpool Council. Charishma was raised in Liverpool after, like many other Liverpool residents, migrating to the area with her family as a young girl. She's a registered occupational therapist and currently works for Headspace, the National Youth Mental Health Foundation. This is her first term on Liverpool Council, and Charishma looks forward to working with the community to make Liverpool the best place to live and work. Great to have you here today, Charishma.
Thanks, David.
We also have Judy Harper. Judy works with Red Cross. She's the Regional Manager, Central Southern Region in New South Wales. Judy's worked in the community sector for over 30 years, predominantly with people with cognitive disabilities, those in the justice systems with complex needs, and also in the advocacy space. Great to have you here as well, Judy.
Thanks, David.
Brilliant. So let's start and talk a little bit about this issue of social isolation and the impacts of that. The impact of the pandemic on the population's mental health is of increasing global concern. We talk about it all the time. We're hearing that for women in unsafe living arrangements, young people, those living in one-person households, and those with preschool-aged children, the situation has been even worse. To all of you here today, has our mental health deteriorated during COVID-19? That's a bit of a loaded question. Good start. Rachel, let's start with you on this one.
Thank you, David. I wish there were a straightforward answer to that, and I think most of us assume that to some degree, yes, the population's mental health has been negatively impacted by the pandemic. And you know, I'm sure there will be pockets of people who actually say secretly they've really enjoyed it. They're a bit of a hermit. They quite like being at home and not being forced into social situations. But I think most people to some degree or another have struggled over the last few months, and whether that is a struggle just to readjust your routines and your expectations of what your day looks like, because for many of us that is built around going to two places, school, work, voluntary activities, whatever that is, and people that we see at those times. So readjusting to that not happening, I think, is problematic. But there's this, what we have really heard at Lifeline is this kind of more existential angst in a way, which is around how long is this going to go on for? Is this a sign of things to come? Is this a pattern that we're going to continue seeing? You know, is lockdown going to become something that we become increasingly familiar with? And certainly those themes that came very quickly off the back of the bushfires and a lot of anxiety that we were hearing around the state of the climate and what this meant for the future. I think there's this real sense of what does the future hold? We've been through some really severe, unusual, unprecedented circumstances in the last 12 months. And I think that the impact of that, those bigger worries on people's mental health, is actually as significant as the day-to-day impacts of restricted movement and less social contacts and disruption to routine.
Wow, you're absolutely right, Rachel. We look around the world and it's not as if the crisis is over, is it? It's still continuing. Judy, giving you a bit of a chance there to talk about mental health. Is this what's been happening? Is it a mental health crisis that we've been talking about, what we're in the middle of?
I do think that's it's a very, it doesn't have a definitive answer. And I suppose from our experience, it depends upon your age and stage and what potentially has been happening for you that impacts the degree, I suppose, that it impacts people's mental health. Certainly we've had, you know, the people that we support, for some of our older isolated people, the impacts have actually not been that huge because they're often quite isolated, aren't out and about and aren't interacting that much anyway. So, and again, some of them have quite relished some of it being a little bit quieter. But for young people, young mums who have just had a new baby and not being able to connect with family and get that family support that they might normally get at that time, at, you know, the birth of a child, or for people exiting the jail system who are already finding it difficult to connect to community, and all of a sudden everybody's doors are closed and they've got absolutely no idea where to get help. So, and I think it also depends upon people's previous experience. So again, you know, there are a lot of people with who experience mental health issues from time to time or on an ongoing basis, who are incredibly resilient and have great resources to support themselves. And so for some of those people, they've got the skills and they're well equipped. And certainly what we've found through making a lot of the additional calls that we've made to people who have been in isolation due to COVID, is it's the people who aren't used to thinking about their mental health, or maybe don't have those strategies in place, or haven't experienced needing to reach out to a service. They've never perhaps accessed a support service in their life, and there's skills that they don't necessarily have because they don't use them on a day-to-day basis. And I think for some people that's where it's been much more of a shock. And again, that anxiety around how long do I have to be adaptable, and how long is this, the uncertainty, I think, is creating that. So it's certainly not a one size fits all, as mental health never is. And for us with Red Cross, and I suppose the contact we have is with the people that we support, is where it disproportionately impacts some people. And I think there's potentially some myths around who it impacts most, or who it has impacted most. Yeah.
Judy, really great points, and we're going to come back to that. I think that's really important. Charishma, giving you a bit of an opportunity there to talk about mental health and COVID. What are you seeing?
Sure. Well, Rachel and Judy have picked up on a lot of the kind of features of how it's, you know, impacted different people in very different ways. I think any time where you have a situation where people's routines, their daily lives, their their normal has been disrupted so significantly, you're going to have a process of adaptation where people use the tools and the strategies they need to kind of acclimatise themselves to that situation. Working with young people, obviously for many young people, they don't know what their toolkit involves, what to use, and you know, a lot of them have never really reached out to a service, as Judy sort of mentioned before. And so for young people, the impacts of you know, how to live their lives very differently have been you know, greatly exacerbated some of the features of the situation. The other sort of the other thing that I see in my daily work has been the real impact of not being able to connect with social networks, in particular for young people. For a lot of adolescents, this is a time of their lives when their role models, the people that they refer to and they are regularly in contact with, are their friends more so than their family. And you know, where you've got a situation where a lot of them are not able to meet with their friends for an extended period of time, that has a whole range of impacts on their lives, their ability to cope with their situations, and also sort of on the impact on their mental health. On a council level, in terms of local government, we have seen a real shift in the way that communities can interact with each other and get a sense of place and get a sense of community, because when, you know, for a long period of time you've had parks, other facilities, and you know, even now you have large gatherings that are still restricted, you have to really change the way that you're interacting with your support networks, with your communities, and really it's given a lot of people, I think, an opportunity to reflect and reevaluate on their lives and their role within their community. So it certainly hasn't been a similar impact for everyone.
Thank you for that, Charisma. One of the most brutal things that I think I've heard as part of the discussion around COVID-19 is that what it's basically done is brought a lot of the conditions for some people to the mainstream. That is, that it's forced isolation on a large number of us, when indeed some people were already fairly isolated at the beginning. And I know it's a very brutal kind of reflection of what's happening in society. I also heard today that actually there have been some good things that have come out of COVID-19, in that maybe older people in communities are maybe being connected to more often than they might have done in the past, in a very deliberate kind of way. I'm talking here about the bigger condition of our society, how we're all part of something and in some ways not part of things. I think that notion of being lonely in a very big crowd, I think is something that is something we need to reflect on here. I'd like to get down to the nub of some of that. Judy, before you mentioned that there are some people who have been impacted more than others, did you want to make a few comments about that to start?
Yeah, I suppose. So, I mean, generally in terms of loneliness, and it's sad reflection that, you know, there's a lot of research and evidence being done and focus on loneliness generally long before COVID-19 compounded that. And some research that Red Cross did identified that the people who reported being loneliest across the country were 18 to 30-year-old men, which, you know, to many people, you know, lots of people find that quite surprising. So, and that's certainly been our experience through COVID, is around it's different for different cohorts, and that digital access and literacy is not equal. And so we work with a lot of young parents, and, you know, lots of assumptions can be made about young people being digitally connected, and, you know, so they're not socially isolated and they're already, you know, great users of social media or whatever. But for the young families that we work with who have really complex needs and are young parents, so often under the age of 18, they've often not finished school. They don't have the money to have iPhones or to have regular credit or to have internet access. They don't necessarily have you know, internet access at home. And so when this hit, we spent a huge amount of time actually resourcing young people to actually be able to access this raft of things that became available online for them. And I suppose the other area is around older people who are already isolated, but perhaps because services stopped and those sorts of things, that person who, you know, the Meals on Wheels volunteer, you know, who would stop and have a chat and do those sorts of things during the day. They're still delivering the meals, but they can't have the chat, you know, so they might only be small things, but it sort of disproportionately impacts some people. And the other area is really around people on temporary visas. So we've done a huge amount of work and supported something like 29,000 people in 3 months across the country who are on temporary visas, who are already in an uncertain situation, who lost employment and then were again. It's that disproportional impact, and it's not always the people that we think about, and I think it's not always the people that are visible to us in community either.
Judy, you mentioned the digital divide, that really we have to get people access to the internet, to this kind of weird social isolation that we've kind of got, looking at each other through a square on the screen. Is it actually, can we get to 100%? How close can we get? If we really had a program to get people together in a digital world, could we do it? Or we just...
I tend to be the eternal optimist and a bit of a Pollyanna at the best of times. So I would like to think that is possible, but I also think that if you don't have that as an end goal, then you're striving for something not as much as it's not as much as what we need. So my view is that we should always be striving for that high end goal. But it's also acknowledging that there's a raft of players in that. And I think that's one of the things that's come up for us around the impact of COVID and loneliness, which we knew, but it's highlighted it. Is there's a raft of people who are involved and responsible. So whether that's, you know, the federal government and NBN access, whether that's employment for young people so they can actually afford to buy credit and have, you know, internet access connected or a computer. It's about education and access to digital literacy, and not assuming that young people, just because they are young, that they can do that. And similarly, not assuming that old people can't do that. You know, we've got some amazing groups of older people who have set up Zoom networks to connect with each other and are really enjoying it. You know, it's not for everybody, but
Judy, I think your point's really well made, that we need to do better, and that's where we have to go. And thankfully, we're talking from a position where we're not as much of a crisis as we were. And so maybe what we're really talking about now is resilience for the future, really. And I'd like to get some comments from people on that one, but also want to dig a little deeper in terms of this nexus between social isolation and the social impact. And I know that both you, Charishma and Rachel, deal with communities there. Let me ask a really pointed question. So how much of a causal factor is social isolation to people calling your service, Rachel? Let's start with the crunchy bit there.
Yeah, I mean, we would say that either directly or indirectly, probably around at least half of our calls relate to that sense of loneliness, or more generally a disconnection or an ability to have meaningful relationships with people, because loneliness isn't just about being on your own in a house and and living by yourself, but it's just also about not feeling like you have people that you meaningfully connect with. And we were talking earlier offline around the kind of quality versus quantity of social connections and the people in your life. And, you know, I think that's something we see come through so strongly on Lifeline calls, that people are either calling us because of a lack of connection or a meaningful relationship in their life, or from the impacts of adverse relationships or events that have created uncertainty or difficulty within their relationship. So this sense of connection and having meaning with people and what that means for the way we see ourselves and our place in the world is really important. And when you were talking earlier about kind of the prevalence of mental health and this idea of social isolation, I think for a lot of people who have lived for a long time with chronic and enduring mental health problems, this is their normal. And that's one of the things that we have heard a lot from people for who life has just continued completely as normal through this whole period. And they're saying to us, all of a sudden, the rest of the world understands what it's like to be me. They understand what it's like to feel like, you have nobody of importance in your life, or you have no structure or meaning or value to your day, or you're so crippled or constrained by the mental health difficulties that you face that you can't leave your house and you can't talk to other people. So in a way, I hope if nothing else comes out of this, there will be a growing awareness and understanding around what it feels like to live in a much more restricted way, where your activities and your behaviours and your connections are less than they were. Because I think it's good to understand that for some people that's their normal.
Yeah.
It's not a choice that they actively make. It's a set of circumstances that they find themselves in.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Look, we are starting to get some questions come through now, and I think that was a really good starting point. It's obviously getting some reaction from our audience here. So the first question is really, it's a statement that this is such an important discussion, some important insights around the impact on different groups, young people, people on temporary visas, etc. Thank you. Do you see isolation and loneliness manifesting differently in different places? A socio-spatial, geospatial view. And Charisma, I'm going to come to you on this, and I'm happy to repeat that. There was quite a complex question. A socio-spatial, geospatial view.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you very much for that question. It's actually something that I've been interested in and considered for quite a while, because the way, as an occupational therapist, environment is very central to the way that I look at people's health and our community. And a Grattan Institute report, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, identified that the ways that we build and organise our cities can help or hinder social connection. And there's some really fascinating recent research around the impact of loneliness on physical health outcomes in particular. And I really like this this one author's way of putting it, which was the health impact of chronic social isolation can be as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I think that's a really important aspect of our lives that a lot of policymakers don't really stop to consider. Where you know, as far back as Winston Churchill once observed that the way that we shape buildings is important because the buildings then shape us. So some of the ways that we have planned and built our environments in the last few decades have really kind of exacerbated some of the mental health impacts of social isolation and loneliness. So when you look at the most common forms of you know, the physical environment in Western Sydney in particular, suburban sprawl and high-rise sprawl are, you know, the two most common forms of built environment that are encroaching on Western Sydney at the moment. And the way that these spaces are designed actually discourage people from interacting with each other. And one of the things that I'm very proud about in terms of what we're doing at council at the moment is council is working with the Sydney Southwest Local Health District to actually embed health outcomes and that sort of thing into urban design and planning. And we've also looked at other ways of facilitating interactions between members of our community. You know, one of the aspects of Southwest and Western Sydney is that we do have a very high proportion of people from a culturally and linguistically diverse background who have English as a second, third, fourth, or even fifth language. And for many people, mainstream mental health services may not be so encouraging, may not be so appropriate, and may not be something they're very comfortable accessing. And so, you know, other soft entry points, if you will, of encouraging social interaction, of then, you know, getting them more aware of how they can build some of those tools and techniques to improve their resilience and coping skills are incredibly important to consider, because these are people within our community that are not getting the assistance and the help that they need, and mainstream services may not be so appropriate for them. So those are very important considerations that I think are just starting out. And my hope in particular is that, COVID and the things that we have seen over the last 12 months really turbocharges changes in thinking, in the approach that we have to planning, particularly our physical spaces.
Charishma, that's really interesting stuff. You're talking about health being a consideration in planning and urban design. Mm-hmm. Is there a couple of examples you want to throw at us there? Like you mentioned interaction. Is it about interaction mostly?
It's about, well, a lot of the time it's about how we actually plan casual interaction within our urban spaces. So, for example, recently, Liverpool Council, we went through about a 2.5-year process to master plan our CBD. And part of the reason why we took so long to do that is because we looked at everything from how we design street furniture to encourage people who may not really know each other to interact, to actually sit down, to take in the environment around them, to perhaps strike up a conversation with someone. And we noticed that in the centre of our CBD, one of the most popular things was this massive chess set that's been around for about 20 odd years. And, people who had never met each other before were, getting really, really engaged and involved through this chess set. So it was about, using a small interaction like that and actually extrapolating it into how we could, design a master plan for our CBD around those sorts of things. It's also about,
Is it consistent with COVID? Are they heading in different directions? I mean, COVID seems to be pushing people apart. You're talking about pushing people together.
I am. I think you can, because one of the features of COVID is not necessarily, banning social interaction altogether. I think it's actually encouraging people towards interacting in smaller groups. And that's quite interesting because Rachel mentioned before this sort of, trying to get this balance between quantity of interactions or quantity of friendships and quality of friendships and interactions. And often you'll find that you can have more meaningful conversations, more meaningful interactions in smaller groups than in larger ones. And so this sort of drive towards engaging with other people, but in a safe way, through smaller groups of people getting together, actually may facilitate those sorts of things. However, the grassroots energy from community is actually very important to kind of consider as well, because just as we had all of these restrictions that came down, we also had community driven this community driven drive to engage with other people through things like having a postcard drive where you put postcards in the letterboxes of everyone in your street or your neighbourhood, just to check in and make sure that you're okay. That doesn't necessarily require physical interaction, but it does show you that people care about you, that people are thinking of you, and I guess reduces some of those that sense of isolation.
Sorry, Charishma. I'll just keep moving through this. Just Rachel and Judy, we've used the word socio-spatial and geospatial view when we're talking about different places and different groups. Any of those beautiful words, do they push your buttons at all? Is there stuff you want to throw in there?
I don't know if they push my buttons.
Oh, come on, geospatial, what a great word.
Yeah. Yeah, we kind of operate in the national telephony space. It's kind of hard to, and like interestingly, quite on a very anonymous model. So actually, we don't understand a huge amount about where people call us from or their demographics. We don't collect that too much at Lifeline deliberately. So, and just
can I just explore that really quickly in terms of Western Sydney? Do you just basically see Australia as everybody calls from wherever, or do you have?
So there is a way that we can use our telephony data to give us at least a location, like a postcode area where people are calling from, but that's only if people dial in and with a visible number. So a lot of people withhold their number, and in which case we have no data on those people at all, and that's fine. Like one of the premises why our service works well, I think, is because it is anonymous. We don't no one has to tell us anything about themselves, either directly or indirectly. And
And how do you gather data around socio-spatial? Is it like different groups? Are you categorizing people for the purpose of understanding the issues?
So we kind of collate themes of calls. So we try and ascribe, you know, what a call was generally about or what the motivation for calling us was. So we'd certainly capture that, whether it's been a call about relationships or a mental health problem or an addiction or seeking support for someone else, and whether or not suicide has been a factor or a reason for calling. So we do collate that, but that is just on the theme of the call, because people don't give us any other information about themselves. So we might draw inferences about someone's age through a call, but we don't collect enough data on that to determine reason for call by demographic group, for example.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Judy, at Red Cross, you have a lot of your services around regions. Are you noticing some specific issues, different kind of experiences of loneliness between different regions at all?
It's been fairly consistent, to be honest, and it's for different reasons, I suppose. So again, often in regional areas, while smaller communities are really often quite well connected and there's lots of that great local support and some of those initiatives that Charishma was talking about in terms of postcards and checking in on people, it provides more opportunity for those things to happen than in the city. But you've got overlaid with that things like decreased access to transport or to technology, because, you know, the NBN isn't so great in that location. So it's a little bit of checks and balances in some respects. And similarly, you know, we call across metropolitan Sydney, we call 800 people who are socially isolated for one reason or another every day of the week, irrespective of COVID. And again, it depends. You know, they can be in the midst of quite an affluent suburb, or they can be in, you know, a suburb that's deemed to be quite disadvantaged. So the geography doesn't always have an impact. I think the social structure probably has more of an impact, particularly around, again, those people where there might be myths or stereotyping, and that might be felt genuinely, you know, prevalent in the community in terms of them being excluded, but it's also about how they feel about themselves as well. And certainly for a lot of the people we support coming out of jail, who are cycling through jail for reasons of poverty more so than anything else, is that they carry that stigma themselves. They feel like just because they know they've been in jail that everybody else knows that, and that they will naturally be excluded and no one will want to even speak to them, so why would they try? So I think there is a real difference around that. You know, young parents, you know, the stigma attached to, you know, sometimes the things that are said to a 16-year-old mum walking down the street with a bub is often not, what a beautiful baby, isn't that lovely, which might be said to another mum, for instance. So I think that is very real on a day-to-day basis. I don't know that it's been made any worse by COVID, to be honest, because again, I think some of those groups of people deal with that every day of their life, and that's their reality. Yeah, and that the loneliness and social isolation often becomes accepted in their life, and that's not necessarily, well, I don't think that's necessarily the sort of community we would want to be supporting or hoping for the future, where people feel that it's okay and that's just the norm for them because of who they happen to be.
Judy, thank you for your brutal truth telling there. I mean, I think that message about what it's like for people, particularly that imposition of self-isolation, is pretty brutal. Thank you so much for putting that out to us. Really important. The next question is about a particular group. The injured worker community is feeling the impact of COVID-19. This is a message from Rosemary McKenzie Ferguson. This group is already financially isolated before COVID-19 arrived. Hence, many of them simply cannot afford the technology requirements to have the internet at home. Social isolation and exclusion is commonplace within the injured worker community, hence the high rate of attempted and completed suicides, yet no one discusses these issues or how COVID-19 added a layer of loneliness into their lives. Rachel, just because, I mean, I shouldn't jump to you, this is an issue of suicide. People turn to your organisation. Is this what you're finding for a specific group, the injured worker group?
I think I probably couldn't speak to that to that group, because I don't think they would be one of our kind of check boxes on the kind of themes of calls, if you like. I suppose more generally, I think what we have seen is that there are proportions and groups of the population who have never experienced financial or job insecurity before, who currently are now, and for whom this isn't part of their normal. You know, they're not used to relying on money from other sources. They've worked their life, they support themselves. That's their kind of mindset of how things should be. You should work, you should look after yourself. So I think when you're in a position where you can't do that as this group of workers, it sounds like they are, I think that would be incredibly isolating, because not only are you isolated through a pandemic, but also you're living through a set of circumstances that are not part of your normal, and kind of probably go against how you usually see yourself as a fit and healthy person who provides for themselves. I think if you can't do that, that's just another layer of difficulty, I think.
Yeah, and thank you, Rachel. Obviously, the pandemic is more than the pandemic. People losing their livelihoods. Comments from you, Judy and Charisma, on this one? The injured worker community.
I suppose we have we know that some of the people that we call through our telecross program would be part of that community, and often are quite far down the track and have experienced sometimes, family relationship breakdown and those sorts of things because of the impact of loss of income and all the other things that they've sort of experienced as part of that. But it's only probably a very small group that we interact with. And I suppose we see them at the far end where, yes, there has been multiple impacts across their life, but it's only a very small number of people that would contact us.
Charisma, you come across this issue?
Not so much in the headspace space, but one of the things that I guess strikes me in terms of policy and an approach in relation to injured workers is that it's very much obviously been about sort of, things like financial compensation and that sort of thing. Whereas the issues faced by injured workers, as Rosemary's described, are, multifaceted. And so incorporating social connection and how we might be able to do that in the way that on a policy and kind of policy level, that the way that we respond to injured workers and what their circumstances are, I think is really important, because one size does not fit all, and what is experienced by one injured worker may not be experienced by another, and so treating them in a similar way is just not effective.
Okay, thank you, Charisma. And of course, I think what we're learning here is a lot about, it's actually a community response, and being aware of the different parts of our community is really critical. Heather Nesbitt's written a question here for us. She says, has COVID-19 provided a silver lining for more awareness and discussion of mental health issues? Is it more okay now to talk about your mental health? Who wants to start with this one? What do you reckon?
It's actually interesting because we posed this question to our youth advisory group recently, and their answer sort of in some ways surprised us, because you would think that with particularly youth mental health occupying a lot of media attention and community attention in the last while, that it some of the stigma may have been being chipped away at, but actually there is still quite a lot of stigma associated with talking about mental health and well-being, and it very much comes down to the people involved in your support network. If there is a safe space within your friendship circle or your family circle or the people around you, then there is that sort of level of comfort and security to discuss mental health related issues. But if the response is more around treating it as a joke or treating it as something wrong with that person, then people are less likely to talk about it openly and honestly.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to jump in and kind of agree with some of that, Charishma, and I think that what we've seen is a bit of dueling commentary around this idea as well, because on the one hand we've had it's a pandemic, more people than ever are experiencing mental health problems, and it kind of raised awareness over here that it's happening. And then on the flip side of that, we've got the kind of the commentary around, we're just asking you to stay at home for a little while, or some people live in X, Y, and Z more extreme circumstances than you, and kind of get a grip and get a perspective. And so I think there's these kind of dueling, competing commentaries where on the one hand we are encouraging people to be open and to talk about the impact of living through a pandemic and whatever their personal experience of that has been, and to acknowledge why that can be very difficult for a lot of people and has resulted in increased anxiety and depression and other disorders. And then the flip side, we've got the people who are kind of playing it down and drawing unhelpful comparisons, I think. So in some ways, yes, it is continued the dialogue, but I don't know that it's always been a positive or a helpful dialogue. And I think actually the place where there's still, it continues to be very huge amount of stigma is around the discussion of suicide. And actually, even though most people now will be prepared to acknowledge or discuss their own personal experience of having anxiety or depression, or the impact of isolation through the pandemic, still very few people are prepared to openly talk about their experiences of suicide and suicidal thinking. And I think for me that is part of the dial that hasn't really shifted very much.
Judy?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think it's trying to shine more of a light, but it's certainly not encouraging people or helping people feel safe to reach out for support. And in the context of some of the work we do in our, sort of emergency services space in responding to, bushfires or floods or whatever, and that recovery space is a lot of that fits around that COVID. And you still get that reluctance of people not reaching out for help because there's somebody worse off than me, or I just need to, at least I'm alive. I might have lost my house, but I'm alive. So I think some of that rhetoric comes in around COVID as well. It's like, well, I still have a job, so I can't complain about having to work from home, even though it's having a massive impact on my mental health. So I don't, in our experience, it hasn't helped in people reaching out for support or feeling safe to do that.
The other thing I would add that sort of strikes me about this question is that there's, when you look at the media coverage and the discussion, some of the discussion in society around mental health and, what it involves, there's sort of, there's increasing rates of people experiencing mental health issues, but there's no sort of next step. There's no kind of, okay, well, this is what needs to be done, or, this is what you can do in order to kind of take steps to, to be more proactive about your well-being or whatever it might be. And so for a lot of people, this idea of, me experiencing, lack of mental well-being or mental health issues equals therapy, or equals, this sort of stereotype of what mental health intervention looks like. It still exists. And I feel like that scares a lot of people, whereas, that space has actually moved on quite a lot. There's a spectrum of various services, and there's not enough nuance around what's involved in that process. And the other sort of issue is the kind of some of the practical realities of dealing with the system. So we're at Headspace, we're a sort of early intervention service for young people with mild to moderate issues with their well-being, health and well-being, and yet we encourage people to reach out and access support. However, when you don't have the equivalent amount of resources to meet the demand of your community, we service the fastest growing population in Australia. And when when the resources are not there to meet the demand that exists within your community, young people are waiting for a long period of time to get in the door, and that also affects their willingness to engage, and therefore their future idea of what engaging with services looks like as well.
And just that timeliness of a response when, at the moment or the day when you determine that an intervention is needed, whatever that is, with a young person or with anyone else, if you then have to go on a waiting list for a number of weeks or months to receive that, just by the time that person is in a position to receive that service, chances are their mental state is deteriorated further. It's like, it's such a frustration. It's not, you know, it's not unique to this region or city or country. It's an ongoing problem with mental health services, but the lack of access to those kind of mild to moderate services at the time that they are needed is really, it's a theme that we see a lot. We get a lot of calls from people who feel that they're just waiting to see someone and are looking for stopgaps or solutions or things that they can do themselves in the interim to feel supported and keep safe sometimes.
Thank you, Rachel. Really important words. Really important reminder in terms of where we should be heading in terms of policy. I know Heather really appreciated those really great in-depth answers there. Jane Brock has come in with a question that takes us in a slightly different direction. What data do you have on cold experienced loneliness, emotional and mental health issues, as well as how they access services to address their loneliness? So maybe if you were looking for data regarding the cold community and loneliness, where would you start? Where would you go? Rachel, Judy?
I can jump in because I do actually have an example here. So one of the services that we have been piloting and now running on a restricted basis is a text-based services where people receive the same Lifeline intervention, but it's by text, SMS through their phone instead of having to call up. And because we got some funding and we ran it initially as a pilot, and because it's a text-based service, we were able to ask some questions up front of people who were wanting to connect with us. So some of the things we asked about were disability, ethnicity, age group, postcode, etc. So we got a really good picture of the people who used our text-based service. And the other question we asked, would you have used another Lifeline service? And what we discovered in that pilot was that we reached a whole new audience of people. These were not people who had tried to ring and couldn't get through, so had texted us and said they were a completely different demographic. So whereas our phone users tend to be kind of 40, 50 plus age group, much higher prevalence of young people accessing our service through text, much higher above population percentage of Aboriginal and Indigenous users. So 5% using our text space as opposed to less than 1% who use our phone service on a population average of 3% of the population. So much higher group there. And we saw the same pattern with people calling us from connecting through from linguistically diverse backgrounds and from any non-English speaking background. And I think that layer of anonymity and not being judged by what people can hear or perceive through your voice has really allowed us to open up our service to groups like the COLD community in a way that we can't really access as well or as effectively through our phone service. So we actually got some quite good data around who uses that population and some good insights into the ways in which people prefer to access services, particularly if they're not from a traditional English-speaking background.
Rachel, really important information for service providers out there, using different methods of communication to actually look at service delivery and how to connect. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. The other part of that question was about what data do you have on COLD experiencing loneliness, emotional and mental health issues. Does anybody have a quick pointer here for Jane? Where would you go?
I think this is actually one of the gaps that exist for services out there, because I know individual services measure their own engagement with CALD populations and their own sort of client base, but there is not a systematic collection of data that's accessible across services or across the sector. And I know that often we have to very heavily rely on people, our engagement with people in CALD communities in order to sort of address issues that may come up because they're kind of being missed in the official stats or the official data that's coming through Yeah.
Thank you, Charishma. I really appreciate that. The issue of who's experiencing loneliness, is there a definition of somebody who's lonely? Is it subjective, or is there an objective? Is it the number of people, or asking a question? Judy, do you use anything at Red Cross in this space?
Well, it is subjective insofar as the person's own determination of whether they feel lonely, and I'm not aware of kind of an objective sort of definition of it. And certainly from the research that we did, it was around whether people identified themselves that they felt lonely. And again, going back to that and what that's different for different groups of people, whether that's age or gender or cultural background. But I think the part of that was really people self-determining what that meant. So that sort of discussion we were having before about, you can be part of a large family, you can, have lots of colleagues at work and those sorts of things. You can live in a household with 5 people and still feel abundantly lonely inside and have that impact your mental health. And similarly, you have a person who lives alone, who's older, who has no family and no networks, but actually doesn't feel lonely. So I think it is quite subjective, and I think that's important because it acknowledges that individual difference of people's individual experiences of exactly the same scenarios. So, and that's where I suppose with some of the research we did around loneliness and the impact was that coming up with 18 to 30-year-old men generally across Australia identifying that for themselves was quite significant. Yeah.
I see that Jane's come back and said, indeed, Charishma, this is the reality at the moment. I hope that the New South Wales could do something about the collection of data. Thank you for your response. Okay, so I think
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. We're now at, we've got about 8 minutes in total, of which I need a couple of minutes to wind up here. A couple more questions. I might do these fairly quickly then, and we'll see if we can get through them. Just a quick comment from Rosemary, just saying, just for the panel's information, in Western Sydney Basin, the injured worker community, the numbers between 15,000 and 25,000 people plus for their families. So thank you, Rosemary, for the reminder of how big that group is and why we should actually be looking at that. The next question here is from Anonymous. Loneliness is often seen as a personal issue, but is so impacted by the social, cultural environment and policy. Good to hear some of these links discussed. What can be done at a policy level to address this so we move away from this individual deficit approach? Okay, policy level, moving away from individual deficit approach. So really a community issue. Quick comment here. I'll just ask for a really quick summary of a response. Judy, I'll start with you on this one.
Well, it is about a whole of community response and how at multiple levels and a whole of government approach from a policy level, but also acknowledging that it might include business, it might include the built environment of councils. It's a collective approach around having welcoming communities where people can feel connected and safe irrespective of who they are.
Fantastic, Judy. Charishma, you've already talked about the idea of loneliness, the notion of health and urban design and planning. Any more comments in this space?
Yeah, I actually think there is a lot of really interesting moves that's being done sort of overseas that we can really learn from. So in 2017, for the first time ever, the UK had their first Minister for Loneliness. And I actually think, having a senior, having that considered at such a senior level of the government is incredibly important because it allows for some of those really important threads to be brought together and for this to have a really holistic approach. But the other thing is also looking at how the systems that we use are actually kind of getting us further away from the outcomes that we want to have. I can obviously talk for days about the New South Wales planning system and how that's actually not giving forth the best outcomes for our communities. But that's probably where I would start with, where you actually have someone who's accountable and responsible for looking at loneliness within our society.
Fantastic. Rachel, a quick one from you there. I think it's a really important question.
I guess just around from a kind of mental health policy, I suppose what we increasingly see in the sector is that when you have a very clinical approach to dealing with the whole spectrum of mental health problems, it isolates people. You distance my individual experience from your clinical knowledge, and there's a space in between that is uncomfortable and isolating for people. And what we know actually is that peer-led and peer-delivered services that really are around allowing people to share their individual experiences and to not be defined by them, but just to accept them as part of who they are and the life that they lead, and that they are aligned with other people's experiences of the world. I think the more we can shift mental health policy where it's safe to do so into that kind of peer and mutual support and connection, rather than this very clinical space, will allow people to not feel so isolated with their mental health problems, or to feel that they, are sick. It's not an illness model that we need. That is helpful.
It's fascinating.
Just one other quick comment is, I think we don't want loneliness to become stigmatizing, like, the word loneliness to become stigmatizing like mental health has been either, in terms of in 5-10 years time, people don't want to put their hand up and say, I'm lonely, and therefore I can access all of these supports that are now available to me. So I think it's a very fine line to tread around how we use the language as well.
Yeah, you're right. It lumps people together. We often talk about tribes, don't we, in this world now? And let's hope we don't have a tribe of lonely people or isolated people. Yeah, a bit of a scary concept. We have one last one, a comment, I think, here. Maybe there's a question here from Kelly Bard. This is a great discussion. We know from research evidence across many different fields, a sense of connection and belonging is crucial to well-being, development and survival. I'm a researcher at Western Sydney Uni and part of a consortium of non-government organisations, including the Benevolent Society, Caritas, and Save the Children, that we deliver a Volunteer Family Connect, an evidence-based, best practice, structured social relationship intervention in the form of volunteer home visiting. So forgive me if that was all complex. Should have put some commas in it. The program is designed to support families with young children experiencing social isolation. Volunteer Family Connect mobilises trained volunteers who act as a social bridge and support, linking families into their local community. During COVID-19, Volunteer Family Connect moved to the virtual space, providing support to families via phone calls and online platforms. Through the lockdown, we found the volunteer family relationship was so very important for fostering social connection for many of these families. Kelly, that is such a lovely example of what we have to do as a group to overcome the needs for particular parts of our community who are socially isolated. I think a lovely way to summarize that. I know we all want to make a quick comment there. Judy?
Oh no, I'm just totally agreeing with the notion of the benefit of volunteer involvement, similar to peer-led, is our constant feedback from the people that we support, is that notion of voluntary service is important because it makes them feel valued, because somebody's not being paid to be with them, that somebody's voluntarily making the choice to be with them. And so the power of that is similar to the experience around the importance of peer-led support as well.
Brilliant. I know Mary-Ann Doherty, one last comment here. This is a comment, some great research and data from Relationships Australia on the subject of loneliness. Thank you, Mary-Ann, a place for us to go to. I definitely recommend people look up their report. It's a couple of years old, so that's Relationships Australia, but still very relevant research. I think the research is ongoing. Can't remember if it covers whole communities, but definitely makes reference to age, gender, and socioeconomic status. Mary-Ann, that's a great way to finalise there in terms of getting more information. Just one last question of you all, really, really quick one. What is one piece of advice you can give to our audience today in making a practical difference in the lives of people experiencing loneliness during COVID-19? One last one.
Can I, just in the sort of space of, I guess, connecting people with services and useful resources, there's a coalition that's called Ending Loneliness Together, or the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness, that was established in 2017, which brings together a lot of research and other work that's being done in this space. So for people in the audience that are interested in that sort of thing, please have a look.
Really helpful, thank you. Charishma, while we've got you there, one last thing. In terms of a summary, we've had an hour long here talking about some big picture issues, big and small. What would be the one thing you'd recommend? What's the one thing to give our audience today a practical difference in the lives of people experiencing loneliness?
I guess start with the achievable things, and whether it's within your service or whether it's in your own life, reaching out to those that you can, in order to, whether it's checking on them or re-establish contact or whatever it might be. I think that's where addressing loneliness starts. So it's the small things that can make a really significant impact.
Fantastic. Rachel?
I guess similar lines, really, to think small about who and what those meaningful connections are for you in your life, and take every opportunity to build on them. And they might be connections with people, or they might be connections to work, or to a voluntary organisation, or some kind of community activity. Whatever you do in your week, or whoever you are with that makes you feel good, take all the opportunities that you can to build on those and connect with them in less obvious ways, if that's not possible to do the usual face-to-face.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. Judy?
Mine would be about not making assumptions about who might be experiencing loneliness or what the best response might be, to ask and to listen. And perhaps we don't need to use the word lonely or mental health. It's about listening and hearing and responding to what people are saying.
Judy, that is a beautiful way to finish. So we're talking here today about connectedness, about what we do together. And I think we've done a lot of that today. I want to thank each of our speakers today for really being involved in what I think has been a great look at the issue of loneliness and the social impact of that on our lives. We're going through a tough time in terms of COVID-19. It's been tougher, and let's hope it doesn't get tough again. Let's hope that what we're talking about here is helping our community become more resilient into the future. I really appreciate your time today and your thoughts. I want to wish you well, and I know that we've learned an enormous amount in terms of what this topic is really all about. Thank you so much for that. In summary, we've covered off this notion of loneliness. Of course, is really it's a construct. It's really how we relate to each other. In fact, it's not all that well defined, and it's something that we need to deal with at the planning level and at the personal level, indeed at the service delivery work level. I want to remind you all today that the Western Sydney Community Forum has a range of services to support the community sector in Western Sydney during these tough times. Contact us for further questions or support. Thank you so much for attending today. I appreciate your spending your time. Let's hope that there aren't people out there because of this race that's just about to run. I know we're probably competing with it right now. Thank you again. Talk soon.